I wanted to talk about, maybe only one. The one thing with the Auditors Conference is we never have trouble filling it. There's always more information than you need, and I know these last 2 days have just been packed, kind of overwhelming at times. One of the people that we didn't get worked into the schedule was John Mallers from Child Support Division. So he gave me a little thing that he would like to kind of promote here, since he's not here to do it. So the Child Support Bureau and the Financial Quality Assurance Unit recently sent an invitation for webinars that will be held on November 1st and 2nd. These webinars will cover the new Auditor's Health Insurance Form that should help simplify insurance reimbursements for the Title IV-D program. This form must be completed and submitted to both CSB and the Title IV-D agencies in the county by December 31st, 2018. CSB will host a webinar on those 2 days, November 1st, which is a Thursday, and Friday, November 2nd. You can choose whichever one works, they're the same. And they will go over the Auditor Health Insurance Form in detail. And there will be staff available to answer any questions about the form or the recent released health guidance. So we just wanted to point that out. We didn't have quite as many questions as we usually do, so we're not going to take the full amount of time on the agenda. But because my partner was talking so eloquently on grants, she took over my whole time slot. Got to remember that for the future. And, you know, I got to talk. So I am going to go over the presentation that I did have, if it comes up. A little quickly, I'm not going to take a full half hour on that, and then we'll do the questions and answers. And it really was on the appropriations, and I think maybe I said it so fast that I confused more people than I helped. I know I confused Stephanie during part of it, so I know I confused everybody else too. We get a lot of questions about the appropriations. That's why we thought we wanted to try to fit it in today. First of all, when it comes to your budget and your approval of your budget and all of that, we defer to DLGF. So a lot of times we will say that. This is just kind of an accounting perspective of your budget and dispersing from your funds. And as I said yesterday, if you don't remember anything else, the first thing I want you to remember is before you disperse any money, you need to have two things. You need to have a balance in the fund you are dispersing from that is sufficient to cover the claim you are paying, and you need to have permission to spend, okay? So if your fund has $1 million in it, but you don't have an appropriation, you can't spend it. If you have $1 million appropriation and no fund in the balance, we got a problem there, but you can't spend it. You've got to have both the balance in the fund and the permission to spend. Okay. There is an exception for that on reimbursement grants, and I want to go over that because I think that is confusing as far as the balance in the fund. These are in your PowerPoint. I'm not going to read them to you, but you have them. These are the code sites. I wanted you to be able to go back and refer to them. It's the one I talked about yesterday, which is our basic audit position that says the county has to have an appropriation to disperse funds unless there is a statutory exception, like the Recorder's Perpetuation Fund or the Commissary Fund, where it specifically says an appropriation is not needed. Okay. This is from the tax code in Chapter 18 about budgeting, and it talks about the fact that you cannot fix a budget or tax levy which exceeds the amount published by your political subdivision. Just so you know, that's where that publishing part comes in. And also in this chapter, except as otherwise provided, you cannot appropriate funds in such a manner that your expenditures will exceed that budget that was approved. Additional appropriations, again, this goes through DLGF, and we will defer to them on that. I think they are planning legislation to try and remove those approval of funds out of there to kind of clean it up a little bit, but until that passes, we kind of defer to them on that. But if you do not have sufficient appropriation and you have a claim you need to pay, you can do additional appropriations. That's still there. That's on the table. They're trying to persuade you maybe not to send in as many, but you have the right to ask for it. It's in the statute. You can ask for additional appropriation. Okay. You can also transfer appropriation if you have an unused appropriation somewhere else that you want to transfer there. There are some rules for that. If you are in the same department and they want to move maybe supplies up to personnel, if your county policy allows that, the auditor can make that transfer of the appropriation. If you don't have the policy, the council has to approve that. If you are moving from one budget to another, the council has to approve that. If you are moving across departmental budgets and you're changing it from one department to another, then you have to go through where the council reduces the appropriation in one and adopts an additional appropriation for the other, and then that has to go through the state for additional appropriations. There are exceptions within the statute. Insurance funds, we talked about a little bit yesterday. Again, if you receive an insurance payment for damage to an asset, you are going to repair or replace that asset within 12 months, you can reappropriate that insurance settlement to make that payment. Reimbursement grants from either state or federal by statute, your council can reappropriate that without going through additional appropriations. So when you get that reimbursement payment from the state or from the, usually from the state, but even if a federal passed through the state, the council can reappropriate that and you don't have to do the whole additional budget, additional appropriations. Also, if you have erroneous or excessive disbursements in the same calendar year, so you pay a claim twice, you realize it, or your vendor says, hey, you already paid this and sends the money back. If it's in the same calendar year, you can reappropriate that. Move to a new calendar year, you can't do that. You're going to have to get a new appropriation for it or have an appropriation for it. Okay. So we talked about federal grants that received as an advance grant do not require appropriation. In this case, the grant agreement that you sign or your commissioners sign is your permission to spend. And the amount of money they give you up front is your limit to what you can spend. So that's giving you really, you're putting that money in the fund. Now you have a fund balance. The grant agreement tells you what you can spend it on, so it gives you permission to spend. I hope that makes sense. State grants that we talked about yesterday, they do require an appropriation, but we, the State Board of Accounts, will not take an audit exception if you receive an advanced state grant and there is a detailed budget in the grant agreement that breaks it down by personnel, service, supplies, the same basic budget classifications, and you use that in place of the appropriation. We will not take exception to doing that, even though they didn't go through a formal appropriation process. Reimbursement grants, which is what most of them are. Advanced grants are kind of rare anymore, but they do happen. Reimbursement grants are a little bit different because in that case, they require the county to make the purchase first, disperse the money, make the expense. Then you send a claim in with proof that you've made that expense, and if it's allowable, they will give you a reimbursement of that expense. Because you are spending county money first, you must have an appropriation for that. So keep that in mind. Secondly, the rule that you must have a fund balance. This is the one time we will not take exception. Technically, what you are doing is taking money from another fund to make that, probably the general, but another fund to make that initial disbursement. If you follow strict accounting rules, we would say advance the money to the grant fund, pay your expense, get your reimbursement, repay your. That's a lot of work. So what we say is you're still doing that basically. However, because rather than do all the whole mechanism of that, you can take your grant fund with zero balance, make your disbursement, which takes it in the red, as long as you are claiming those reimbursements in a timely manner, and you're just waiting for those to come back in. That doesn't mean every reimbursement grant can be in the red for a year at a time. I mean, I've seen some of the financial statements where there's no activity and it's still in the red. Those need to be dealt with. But if there are current reimbursement grants and you are claiming them, or your department is claiming them timely, those can go in the red. And that's what our auditors will be checking during an audit. Is this a reimbursement grant? Are you making the claims? Are we just waiting on those reimbursements? And if they are, they will not take exception to that fund being in the red. That is not the same thing as having an appropriation. Again, there's fund balance and there's permission to spend. Okay. Encumbrances, we get a lot of questions about that. Those are not in the statute. That's an accounting procedure, a budgeting procedure. Basically, if you were doing full accrual accounting, which I know you are not, anytime you had a purchase order, you would encumber that portion. Basically, what you're doing is setting aside that appropriation so that it's not spent. So if you know they're sent out a purchase order that you're going to make this purchase of $100,000, you pull that $100,000 out of the unused appropriation so you don't spend it twice. Most people don't do that, and that's fine. I just want you to know what the encumbrance is. At the end of the year, if you have unused appropriation in a budget line, and you have an expense that needs to be paid from that, it's a claim that may not get paid till January or February. It's a purchase order where you know the claim's going to be coming in, but you've already agreed that you're going to pay that amount. You have a contract where you have an obligation to pay it. You can encumber that amount. You can roll it over to the next year. When those claims are paid, they are posted against last year's appropriation that you've moved forward rather than this year's appropriation. That has to be approved by your council. You cannot just roll over any unused appropriation to the next year. That is not allowed. That is not proper budgeting. You have to have a reason for encumbering it. But if you think about it, if you truly know there's money that should be coming out and it's just a timing issue of when you get that claim or when you get it paid, and it should come out of the 2018 budget, you can roll that amount forward as an encumbered amount, and even in 2019, post it against that, and it will not reduce then your 2019 budget. Does that make sense on encumbrances? And the last slide in there are some reasons for encumbrances. I kind of talked about you have a lawful contract that's not been paid, purchase order that was dated prior to the end of the year, bond issue proceeds. If you should be appropriating them, or your county should be appropriating them when you receive them. Until that project is completed, those roll forward. Okay, so if you've got $1 million project and it's taking you 3 years to complete it, each year you can roll over the unencumbered amount or the unused appropriation to the next year till that in that capital project fund until that project is completed. And also for a state or federal grant that you know is coming in that you've agreed to do a local match to. That's another reason you could encumber.